Every morning before sunrise, while the city slept and the mansion stayed silent, a poor black maid named Zara slipped through a narrow service alley on her way to clean houses she could never afford, carrying 2 breakfasts in her bag, one for herself and one for an old white man named Reese who slept beside a trash enclosure and told stories everyone would have dismissed as madness, stories about buried cases, sealed files, and powerful people who didn't like being remembered. Until one morning Zara arrived with food in her hands and found his spot empty, his blanket gone, his name missing from every shelter and hospital record. And a week later, uniformed police officers knocked on her door at dawn, not to arrest her, but to ask why she was the last person a forgotten investigator trusted before his death, and how her quiet act of kindness had just reopened a case no one wanted uncovered. Zara Thompson learned early that being unseen was part of survival. As a maid, she entered houses through side doors, not front ones. She cleaned rooms where family photos smiled down from silver frames, wiped fingerprints off marble countertops, and folded towels that cost more than her weekly groceries. By the time the homeowners woke up, Zara was already gone, her work erased so completely it looked like she had never been there. Every weekday morning, Zara woke up at 4:45 a.m., not because she wanted to, but because life didn't give her another option. She lived in a one-room apartment above a closed-down hair salon, the kind of place where the pipes groaned like they were tired of holding themselves together. The heat worked when it felt like it. The stove only turned on if she twisted the knob just right. Rent swallowed most of her paycheck, and whatever was left went to bus fare, food, and keeping her phone from getting disconnected. At 5:30 a.m., Zara packed her bag, cleaning gloves, uniform, a small paper bag with breakfast. Usually toast and eggs if she could afford them, sometimes just bread and a banana. She never ate much in the morning. Hunger was a feeling she'd learned to manage. At exactly 6:10 a.m., she cut through the narrow service alley behind the Caldwell estate. That was where she first noticed him. The alley sat between 2 massive properties, hidden from the street by tall hedges and security gates. Delivery trucks passed through during the day, but at dawn it was quiet, too quiet. That's why the old man stood out. He sat beside a rusted trash enclosure on a milk crate, his back straight despite the cold brick wall behind him. He wasn't asleep. He never was. His gray hair was neatly combed, his jacket old but clean. A single bag rested at his feet, folded carefully like he expected to leave at any moment. Zara noticed him on a Monday. She didn't stop. She told herself the same thing she always did. I can't afford this. Someone else will help. I barely have enough for myself. On Tuesday, he was still there. On Wednesday, too. By Friday, she realized he was always there. Same spot, same time, same quiet presence. He never asked for money, never raised a sign, never spoke unless spoken to. For 2 weeks, Zara walked past him. Not because she didn't care, because caring felt expensive. Then one morning, everything changed over something small. She boiled 4 eggs instead of 2. It was a stupid mistake, the kind that happened when you were exhausted and thinking about bills instead of breakfast. She stared at the extra eggs on the counter, calculating in her head. She could save them for later, or they'd probably go bad by evening. She thought about the old man in the alley. Her feet slowed when she saw him that morning. She stood there for a second too long, heart beating faster than it should have. "Excuse me," she said finally. The old man looked up. His eyes were sharp, clearer than she expected. "Yes," he replied. She held out the paper bag. "I made too much. Would you like this?" He didn't reach for it right away. Instead, he studied her face, like he was trying to understand her intention. People usually didn't stop for him unless they wanted something: gratitude, forgiveness, proof they were good. "Only if you don't need it more," he said. Zara swallowed. "That's not how this works." A pause. Then he accepted the bag carefully, as if it were fragile. "Thank you," he said. "I'm Reese." Zara. That should have been the end of it. She should have walked away. But something about the way he said thank you, steady, not desperate, made her linger. You come through here every morning, he said. Always in a hurry. She blinked. You've been watching? Hard not to, he replied. You walk like someone chasing time. That made her laugh, a short sound she didn't expect. From that morning on, the routine began. Zara brought breakfast every day. Sometimes eggs. Sometimes toast and peanut butter. On better days, coffee in a reused cup she'd washed 100 times. Reese never asked for anything specific. He always accepted whatever she brought with the same quiet gratitude. They talked while she stood, checking her watch. Reese told stories, odd ones, about cases that disappeared overnight, about officers who suddenly transferred after asking the wrong questions, about files sealed so tight they might as well have been buried with the truth. Zara listened politely, nodding when it seemed right. She assumed what most people would: confusion, imagination, loneliness filling in gaps where importance used to be. She never said it out loud. One morning, she noticed bruises around his wrist. What happened? She asked, frowning. Reese glanced down. Old injuries don't like being reminded they exist. She frowned deeper. That doesn't sound like an answer. He smiled faintly. Most truths don't. Sometimes, wealthy residents pass through the alley without looking at either of them. Other times, they look too hard, eyes narrowing, lips tightening, like poverty was something contagious. One morning, a man in a tailored suit shoved Reese's bag aside with his foot. Keep this area clear. The man snapped, not even stopping. Zara felt heat rush through her chest. That's a person, she said sharply. The man didn't turn around. Reese quietly picked up his bag. His hands trembled slightly. You shouldn't fight battles for people like me, he said once the man was gone. Zara met his eyes. Someone should have fought for you. Reese studied her for a long moment. That, he said softly, is why this matters. She didn't ask what he meant. Her bus was coming. She handed him his breakfast and walked away, unaware that this small routine, this quiet decision to see someone the world ignored, had already set something in motion that neither of them could stop. By the third week, the alley no longer felt empty. It still smelled like damp concrete and trash bins, still echoed with the distant hum of traffic from the main road. But now it held something else. Familiarity. Expectation. A quiet understanding that at 6:10 every morning, two people who had nothing in common on paper would meet in the same narrow space and pretend, for 10 minutes, that the world made sense. Zara didn't talk about it with anyone. She didn't mention Reese to her coworkers, didn't explain why her grocery bill had gone up by a few dollars, didn't justify why she packed 2 breakfasts instead of 1. Some things felt too fragile to expose to opinions. Every morning followed the same pattern. She'd wake before dawn, wash her face in cold water because the hot took too long to heat, and stand in her tiny kitchen doing math in her head. Eggs were cheaper this week. Bread was on sale. Coffee would have to wait. She always made sure Reese's portion was packed first. Only then did she think about herself. At the alley, Reese was always waiting. He never slept when she arrived. He sat upright, watching the street, like someone standing guard over memories no one else could see. Sometimes he greeted her with a nod. Sometimes with a quiet, "You're late," even when she wasn't. "You know I'm on a schedule," she told him one morning, handing over a paper cup of coffee. "You always are," he replied. "Schedules keep people from drifting." She frowned. "You sound like you've drifted plenty." Reese smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Not by choice. As the days passed, Zara began to notice things she hadn't at first. Reese's shoes were worn, but polished. His clothes were old, but always clean. He folded his bag every morning like he expected an inspection. He never asked personal questions, but he remembered everything she said. "How's your aunt?" he asked one day. Zara blinked. "I mentioned her once." "You mentioned she raised you," Reese said, "and that she hates when you skip meals." Zara laughed softly. "She would have liked you. She would have told you to stop feeding strangers and feed yourself," Reese said. Zara didn't deny it. Her life outside the alley was tightening. The cleaning company had cut hours. One homeowner complained she missed a spot behind a faucet and docked her pay. Her landlord slid a reminder under her door. Polite but firm. At night, Zara lay on her mattress on the floor, staring at the ceiling, wondering which bill could wait another week. Some nights, she skipped dinner. She told herself it was temporary. One morning, she brought only toast and peanut butter. "I'll make it up to you," she said quickly, embarrassed. Reese shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. You say that like you're sure." "I am." That same morning, a delivery truck pulled into the alley earlier than usual. The driver honked impatiently. "You can't sit here," he barked at Reese. "This is private property." Reese didn't move. Zara felt something twist inside her. "He's not bothering anyone," she said. The driver scoffed. "Lady, this isn't your problem." Zara turned to Reese. "Do you want me to call someone?" Reese shook his head slowly. "No. Attention is expensive." The driver eventually left, muttering under his breath. Zara watched Reese carefully after that. "You're not scared," she said. "You're cautious." Reese met her gaze. "There's a difference." As weeks passed, his stories changed. They became less dramatic, more precise. Dates instead of vague timelines. Names spoken once, then never repeated. Places described in detail and then brushed aside like they were dangerous to linger on. One morning, he said, "There's a difference between being forgotten and being erased." Zara frowned. "What's the difference?" "When you're forgotten," Reese said, "no one's looking for you. When you're erased, someone made sure of it." She laughed lightly, uneasy. "You should really write these things down." He looked at her sharply. "No." The word landed heavier than she expected. A few days later, Zara noticed something else. Reese had a limp he didn't have before. "What happened to your leg?" she asked. He shifted slightly. "Weather change." "That's not how weather works." He gave her a look. "Neither is the truth." That morning, she saw faint marks on his wrist again. Redder this time. "Did someone hurt you?" she asked, lowering her voice. Reese didn't answer right away. "Zara," he said finally, "if you ever stop coming one morning, promise me you won't come looking." Her stomach tightened. "Why would you say that?" "Because some doors close behind you whether you want them to or not." She stared at him. "That's not fair." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." The words followed her onto the bus. At work, Zara scrubbed floors harder than necessary, her thoughts looping. She caught her reflection in a polished surface, tired eyes, shoulders slumped. Mrs. Daniels, one of the homeowners, watched her from the kitchen. "You look thin," she said. "Are you eating?" "Yes, ma'am," Zara lied. That evening, Zara stood in her kitchen staring at the last 2 eggs. She could make them for herself, or for the morning. She chose the morning. When she arrived at the alley the next day, Reese looked at the bag and then at her. "You didn't eat," he said. Zara stiffened. "How would you know? You walk slower when you're hungry." She scoffed. "You make it sound like a science." "It is," he replied. "Observation keeps people alive." He broke the toast in half and handed part back to her. "Fair," he said simply. Zara turned away so he wouldn't see her eyes fill. That was the morning everything shifted. Because for the first time, Zara realized this wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was 2 people keeping each other upright in a world that didn't notice when they fell. And somewhere, quietly, unseen, someone else was noticing. Zara knew something was wrong the moment she turned into the alley. It wasn't anything obvious at first. The trash enclosure was still there. The brick wall still cast the same long shadow across the concrete. The air smelled the same, damp, stale, untouched by the sun. But the space felt hollow, like a sound that should have been there had been muted. Reese's milk crate was gone. Zara slowed, her grip tightening on the paper bag in her hand. She took a few more steps, scanning the alley like she'd misplaced something important. "Reese," she called softly. Her voice echoed back to her, thin and unanswered. His bag was gone too. The careful fold he always made. The jacket he draped over it. Even the faint chalk mark on the wall where he leaned was wiped clean, like someone had scrubbed him out of the space entirely. Zara stood there longer than she should have. She checked her watch. 6:12 a.m. He was never late. She told herself the obvious things first. Maybe he moved. Maybe someone told him to clear out. Maybe it's too cold. Still, she waited. 6:18. Her bus came and went. Zara didn't move. She crouched near the wall, setting the paper bag down carefully, like he might return at any second, and she didn't want the food to get cold. "Don't do this," she whispered, to herself, to the empty space. At 6:27, reality started to press in. She grabbed her bag and ran for the next bus, her chest tight the entire ride to work. At the Caldwell estate, everything looked the same as always. The gates, the trimmed hedges, the security camera that followed her movement just long enough to remind her she was being watched. But Zara couldn't focus. She scrubbed the same countertop twice. Dropped a glass she didn't remember picking up. When Mrs. Caldwell asked her a question, Zara answered with the wrong name. "You all right?" Mrs. Caldwell asked. "Yes, ma'am," Zara said automatically. She wasn't. That evening, Zara went back to the alley. It was emptier in daylight, louder somehow. The marks she'd noticed earlier were gone. Even the small pile of flattened cardboard Reese sometimes used was missing. It was like he had never existed. Zara checked the surrounding streets. Behind the grocery store. Under the bridge 2 blocks down. She felt ridiculous, pacing like she'd lost a child, but she couldn't stop. The next morning, she came again. Still nothing. By the third day, the quiet turned into something sharper. Fear. She started asking questions. At the corner shelter, the woman behind the desk barely looked up. "Name?" "Reese," Zara said. "Older man. Gray hair. Sleeps near the Caldwell alley." The woman typed, shook her head. "We don't have him. Could you check again? We don't track everyone." At the public clinic, the nurse gave her the same answer. No intake. No records. Zara walked home with a growing knot in her stomach. On the 4th morning, she brought breakfast anyway. She set it where Reese usually sat. Toast. An apple. A folded napkin. She hesitated, then scribbled a note on the back of a receipt. "I hope you're okay. Z." She left it there like an offering to someone who might never return. That night, Zara dreamed of the alley. Reese was there, sitting on the crate, but every time she tried to reach him, the space stretched longer, wider, until she couldn't see him anymore. She woke up with her heart racing. On the 6th day, she noticed something that made her stop breathing. A paper notice taped crookedly to the wall outside the public hospital near her apartment. Unidentified male, deceased. Age range. Description. Zara read it 3 times. Her hands started shaking. She went inside the hospital, heart pounding, asking questions she didn't want answered. A tired clerk pulled up a file. "Do you know him?" the clerk asked. Zara's voice caught. "I think so." The clerk nodded slowly. "He passed 2 nights ago? No ID. No emergency contact." Zara felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. She walked home in a daze, her mind replaying every conversation, every story she hadn't believed. That night, she remembered the envelope. It sat at the bottom of her bag, slightly bent at the corners. Reese had handed it to her 2 weeks earlier, his expression serious in a way she'd never seen. "If anyone ever asks," he'd said, "this explains why I didn't stop." She'd promised not to open it. She sat on the edge of her bed, the envelope in her hands, fighting the urge. Not yet, she told herself. Not unless someone asks. Sleep didn't come easily. The knock came at 6 a.m. Sharp. Controlled. Official. Zara froze. The knock came again. She opened the door slowly. 3 police officers stood in the hallway. Uniforms crisp. Faces unreadable. "Zara Thompson?" the lead officer asked. "Yes. We need to ask you some questions about Reese Holloway." Her breath caught. "He told you my name?" she whispered before she could stop herself. The officer studied her carefully. "Yes, he did." They stepped inside her apartment, careful not to touch anything unnecessary. Zara sat at her small kitchen table, hands clenched in her lap. The officer spoke gently. "You were the last person he spoke to regularly." "I just brought him breakfast," Zara said, her voice shaking. The officer nodded. "That's why you matter." She swallowed hard. "MS. Thompson, he continued. Reese Holloway wasn't just a homeless man. Zara closed her eyes, not because she was surprised, but because, somewhere deep down, she'd always known. The officers didn't rush her. That was the first thing Zara noticed. They didn't bark questions or glance around her apartment like they were searching for something illegal. They stood quietly, letting the silence settle, as if they understood that whatever they were about to say would change the shape of her life. The lead officer finally spoke. Do you know why Reese trusted you? Zara swallowed. I don't know anything, she said honestly. I just brought him food. That, the officer replied, is exactly why. He nodded toward the envelope on the table. Zara stiffened. You know about this? We know he left something with you, the officer said carefully. We didn't know what. Her fingers trembled as she slid the envelope closer. The paper was worn, softened by time and handling. Reese's handwriting slanted slightly to the right, precise but tired. You haven't opened it, the officer said, more statement than question. No, Zara replied. He told me not to unless someone asked. The officer exchanged a look with his partner. Then we're asking, he said. Zara broke the seal. Inside were folded pages, handwritten notes, careful and deliberate. Names, dates, locations, case numbers. Some crossed out, some circled, some underlined twice, like they mattered more than the rest. At the bottom was a short paragraph. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. Zara didn't know who I was, and that's why I trusted her. She fed me when I had nothing to offer back. These notes are what I couldn't let disappear. They're not complete, but they're true. Zara pressed her hand over her mouth. The room felt too small. One of the officers leaned forward, his voice lower now. Do you recognize any of these names? Zara shook her head. No. That's good, he said quietly. It means you were never part of it. Part of what? She asked. The officer exhaled slowly. Reese Holloway was a senior investigator. Internal affairs. He specialized in corruption cases, officers protecting criminals, evidence disappearing, cases buried under procedural errors. Zara's chest tightened. He told me stories, she whispered. I thought he was confused. So did a lot of people, the officer said. That's how it worked. The second officer spoke for the first time. He refused to close a case he was ordered to close. After that, things started going wrong for him. What kind of things? Zara asked. Transfers, complaints, psychological evaluations, the officer replied. Then silence. Zara stared at the notes again. These dates, she said slowly. They match mornings I saw bruises on him. The room went quiet. That's why we're here, the lead officer said. Because his death doesn't look natural. Zara's breath hitched. We think someone wanted him to stay erased, the officer finished. Zara felt cold all over. He never asked me for anything, she said suddenly. Not money, not help, nothing. The officer nodded. He asked you for dignity. The interview lasted hours. They asked about routines, conversations, specific phrases Reese used. Zara answered everything she could, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. The more she talked, the more she realized how much she'd absorbed without knowing it. Dates lined up. Details matched. Her simple habit, bringing breakfast, had created a timeline no one could erase. When the officers finally stood to leave, the lead one paused at the door. Ms. Thompson, he said, we're going to need to protect you. Zara's heart skipped. Protect me from what? From becoming invisible, he said. After they left, Zara sat alone at her kitchen table long after the sun came up. She called in sick to work. She didn't know how to explain any of this to anyone. Not her coworkers. Not her landlord. Not the world that had walked past Reese for years without seeing him. Later that day, she went back to the alley. It looked different now. Not emptier, exposed. She stood where Reese used to sit, imagining him there, hands folded, eyes sharp. I didn't understand, she whispered. But I listened. A week later, Reese Holloway's name appeared in an internal bulletin. Case reopened. Zara saw it on a TV mounted in a diner window while waiting for the bus. The headline didn't say much. It didn't say everything, but it was enough. Detectives began calling. Journalists tried asking questions she didn't answer. A plainclothes officer walked her home at night for a while. Zara kept working. kept cleaning houses. But something had shifted. She wasn't invisible anymore. One evening, an unmarked car idled outside her building. A woman stepped out, mid-40s, sharp eyes, no uniform. "Zara Thompson?" she asked. "Yes. I'm Deputy Commissioner Elaine Porter," the woman said. "I oversaw Reese's unit years ago." Zara's stomach tightened. "Why are you here?" Porter studied her for a long moment. "Because Reese was right." She handed Zara a folder. Inside was a single document. "Witness status confirmed. You don't owe anyone anything," Porter said. "But what you did matters." Zara looked up. "I just brought him breakfast." Porter smiled faintly. "That's how systems fall apart," she said. "Someone notices." That night, Zara lay in bed staring at the ceiling, realizing something terrifying and strange. Her life before Reese had been about survival. Her life after him was about responsibility. And there was no going back. The first threat didn't sound like a threat at all. It came as a courtesy. Zara was mopping the kitchen floor of a townhouse she'd cleaned every Thursday for nearly a year when her phone vibrated in her pocket. Unknown number. She ignored it. Work first. Always. The vibration came again. Then a voicemail alert. She finished the room, washed her hands, and listened. "Miss Thompson," a calm male voice said, professional and unhurried. "This is Attorney Douglas Keene. I represent parties who may be affected by statements you've recently made. We'd like to clarify a few things. For your protection, please return my call." Zara replayed the message twice. "For your protection." Her stomach tightened. By the time she left work that afternoon, there were 2 more missed calls and an email she didn't remember giving anyone permission to send. The email was polite, polished, carefully worded. It suggested misunderstandings, memory distortion, grief confusion. It emphasized how stressful poverty could be on perception. Zara closed her phone and slipped it back into her bag. She didn't call back. That night, she noticed the unmarked car again. It sat across the street from her apartment, engine off, windows dark. It didn't follow her, didn't approach. It just waited. The next morning, a detective met her at the bus stop. "Routine," he said when he saw her stiffen. "Walk with me." They moved together through the quiet street. "You're not in trouble," he assured her. "But people are nervous." "About what?" Zara asked. "About the fact that you exist," he replied. At the station later that week, Zara gave a formal statement. Every detail, every breakfast, every conversation she could remember. The detective recorded it all, nodding occasionally, asking her to repeat dates, times, phrases. "Did he ever say he was afraid?" the detective asked. Zara thought carefully. "No. He said being seen was expensive." The detective exhaled slowly. He knew. 2 days later, the alley was blocked off. Yellow tape. City workers. A posted notice citing structural hazards. Zara stood across the street watching as the space where Reese had lived was scrubbed clean. They were still trying to erase him. That was when the fear settled in her bones. It wasn't loud fear. It was quiet. Practical. The kind that measured exits and memorized license plates. She stopped taking the same bus every day. She avoided routine. And still, people found her. A woman cornered her outside the grocery store. "You don't understand what you're involved in," the woman said, voice low, urgent. "You can still walk away." Zara stared at her. "Who are you?" "Someone trying to keep you from getting hurt." Zara stepped back. "The truth doesn't hurt people who didn't do anything wrong." The woman's jaw tightened. "That's not how the world works." "No," Zara replied. "That's how your world works." The pressure increased. Neighbors asked questions. Co-workers whispered. Someone slipped an anonymous note under her door. He was already dead. "Stop digging." Zara's hands shook when she read it. She almost called the detective. Instead, she sat on her bed and cried. Hard, silent tears she'd been holding back since the day Reese disappeared. She thought about walking away, about returning the folder, declining interviews, telling herself she'd done enough. Then she remembered the way Reese split his toast and handed half back to her. "Fair," he'd said. Zara stood up and wiped her face. That evening, Deputy Commissioner Porter called. "They're testing you," Porter said bluntly, "seeing if you'll break." "I'm not special," Zara said quietly. "I don't have power." "You have credibility," Porter replied, "and you don't even know it." The next week, Zara was escorted into a government building she'd only ever passed on the bus. Fluorescent lights, security badges, Closed doors. A conference room filled with people waited for her. Detectives. Prosecutors. Oversight officials. One man spoke plainly. We're convening a formal inquiry. Reese Holloway's cases will be reviewed. You'll testify. Zara's heart raced. Testify where? Publicly. The word hit harder than any threat. I clean houses, Zara said. I don't belong in hearings. The man looked at her steadily. Neither did Reese belong on the street. Silence followed. Later that night, Zara walked past the alley one last time. The tape was gone. The wall repainted. No sign of Reese remained. She stood there anyway. I'm still here, she whispered. The wind moved through the narrow space, carrying the sound of distant traffic. For a moment, she imagined Reese sitting there again, watching, listening. Not afraid, just waiting. At home, Zara pulled out the envelope one more time and reread Reese's final words. Zara didn't know who I was. That's why I trusted her. She folded the paper carefully. They wanted her to disappear. Instead, she was about to speak. And once the truth is spoken out loud, it never belongs to the shadows again. Reese was reburied quietly, with only the barest acknowledgement of his existence. No headlines screamed his name across the city. No cameras captured politicians standing stiffly beside his grave, offering speeches rehearsed for the sake of public perception. There were no fanfare or ceremonies, just the raw, unadorned truth of his life and death. It was as though the world, in its endless noise, had finally paused to let him rest in peace. Zara had insisted on attending. She had watched as the soil settled over the coffin, the grave freshly turned, and the simple stone marker engraved with his name. She felt a lump in her throat, the weight of unsaid words pressing against her chest. No one could have known how much this burial meant, not as an act of spectacle, but as a final acknowledgement of the man Reese had been. The city moved on, indifferent as ever. But for Zara, the quiet interlude was profound. She left the cemetery without a backward glance, the crisp morning air brushing against her face as if trying to remind her that life continued, relentless and unyielding. By the next morning, Zara was back on her usual route, the one she had taken countless times in the weeks she had known Reese. The alley where she had first met him, the alley that smelled of rain and dust and the faint remnants of yesterday's garbage, had not changed. It remained tucked away, hidden between two aging buildings, unnoticed by the bustling world just beyond its entrance. She carried the same two breakfasts she always did, one for herself, one for Reese, or whoever would sit in his place now. She hadn't known what to expect, whether the rhythm of her small acts would be disrupted by grief or hesitation. But habits, once formed, are stubborn. And so she walked, her shoes echoing softly against the cracked pavement, the paper bag in her hands rustling like a whisper. A man was there, sitting hunched over the edge of the concrete step where Reese had once been. Zara stopped a few feet away, her pulse quickening, not out of fear, but from the strange, tender familiarity of the ritual. She had done this countless times with Reese, and now she was about to do it for someone who had no idea of the legacy they were stepping into. "Do you want this?" she asked gently, holding out the bag. Her voice carried the soft authority of someone who had loved without fanfare and grieved without complaint. The man looked up, surprise flickering across his features. He was young, maybe not older than Reese had been when they first met. There was weariness in his eyes, a subtle curvature of his shoulders that spoke of nights spent on streets that offered no mercy. For a moment, he said nothing, unsure whether this gesture was real or some cruel trick of circumstance. "Yes, thank you," he finally murmured, his voice tentative. He reached for the bag with cautious hands, as if he feared it might disappear if he moved too quickly. Zara nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile brushing her lips. She had expected nothing in return, not thanks, not conversation, not even acknowledgement. The act itself, the simple passing of a breakfast, was enough. In this small exchange, she felt Reese's presence lingering, not in memory alone, but in the continuation of kindness he had once known. She lingered for a moment, watching as he opened the bag and looked inside, savoring the smell of the warm food. It was a quiet scene, unremarkable to anyone who might have walked by. But in that alley, in that brief intersection of lives, it was everything. Zara moved on, her footsteps carrying her out of the alley and back into the city's hum. But even as the day began, she felt an odd lightness in her chest. Reese's story had ended, yes, but not in emptiness. It had transformed, moved beyond headlines and records, beyond the bureaucratic erasure that had once attempted to bury his existence twice over. And somewhere, in the small acts the world never sees, his life continued. Zara found herself thinking about the patterns of life, how they could be cruel, how they could be beautiful, and most importantly, how they could persist in ways unnoticed. One person's small gesture could ripple quietly, unseen, through countless lives. A breakfast in an alley, a moment of attention paid to someone overlooked, a simple smile. These were the things that outlived ceremonies and newspapers. By the afternoon, the alley was quiet again. The man had gone, taking with him the warmth of a meal and perhaps a fleeting sense of dignity restored. Zara lingered just a moment longer, imagining Reese there, watching over the alley, smiling faintly at the continuation of his work. She could almost hear his voice teasing her, telling her she didn't need to carry 2 breakfasts anymore, though she knew she would. Walking back toward the office, Zara reflected on the subtle ways the world insisted on reminding people of truth. Sometimes it was in grand gestures, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in nothing more than a name etched on a stone. Truth didn't demand applause. It simply existed, quietly insisting that it could not be entirely ignored. And perhaps that was enough. At her desk, she set down her bag, her fingers brushing against the edge of her notebook where she had scribbled notes on her latest project. The city outside hummed with its usual indifference, oblivious to the layers of grief, love, and redemption playing out in hidden corners. Zara smiled faintly to herself. Reese's story, though officially over, had left an echo. A faint pulse in the quiet acts of strangers, in the footsteps of those who would never know his name, but would feel the weight of his presence in a small, almost imperceptible way. She glanced at the clock, then out the window at the endless tide of people moving through streets she knew would never notice her small triumphs or the lives she touched. And yet, she felt connected to something larger than herself, a thread weaving through time and lives, tying the living to those who had passed, and those overlooked to those who finally saw them. In the alley, long after Zara had left, the man held the breakfast in his lap, warmth spreading through him more than the food could ever. And somewhere, perhaps in a subtle shift in the wind, in the light glinting off a puddle, in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, Reese's story continued. Not in files or reports, not in articles or news segments, but in the small, human acts that never seek attention. Zara knew she would return tomorrow. She always returned. And when she did, she would carry the breakfasts, walk the alley, offer what little she could. For her, for him, for the quiet persistence of truth and compassion. Life, she realized, was full circles, and sometimes the smallest acts closed them beautifully. And somewhere, in a world that barely noticed, Reese lived on.